Hello watch enthusiasts! Now for over a year, a number of people have asked me to produce a video exclusively about three-hand time-only watches. And initially I didn't produce this video because I didn't think there would be a large enough following. But if the last couple of years have shown me anything, it's that the world of the no-date watch has certainly gained a serious revival, with watches such as the Rolex Submariner No Date, in addition to the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, gaining an enormous amount of attention despite the presence of date and day-date models being on the market. And I suppose in a world where we can very quickly look at a phone or a computer for the date, it makes sense to have a watch which is delicate and is entirely aesthetic in its approach in telling the time, which these watches do so extremely well. And so without any further ado, I'll talk about a few watches which show a really wonderful use of only the time on their dial, and do so in a fantastically elegant way, and a way which really does set them apart from a number of other watches on the market. And these range from the rather affordable watches in the few £100 mark, up into a few thousands, where you'll see more luxurious timepieces. Now if value and simplicity are what you're after, then for an affordable price, I see the best option being the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical. And this is a relatively young model in the grand scheme of things, but does pay homage to older watches made by Hamilton for the armed forces. Because this watch is a celebration of their Hamilton Hack models, which were produced in the mid-20th century and were used by a great deal of troops as a reliable and accurate watch which could be set very accurately against other watches and synchronised due to the hacking function it had. Of course, nowadays this is by no means something which is extraordinary, but nonetheless frames this watch in history rather nicely and gives it a context for what this watch is trying to be, which is a fundamentally very functional field watch. And whilst this watch is certainly very simple in terms of what it offers, it's a watch where everything and every detail about it has been executed with a great deal of care and done exactly the way it should be to make this watch both enjoyable as a sports watch, but also intensely elegant and highly aesthetically pleasing as well. Of course, the specifications of the watch are very conservative to match that mid-century style, with a 38mm diameter and a 9.5mm thickness thanks to the fact that it's manually wound and not automatic. The case itself is stainless steel and is bead blasted, as you can see, to give this matted effect, which appears like military equipment rather than the more shiny surfaces of a brushed or even a polished case. In order to balance the watch, the crown does an extremely good job through its large size and the fact that, of course, this watch, being manually wound, requires a large and easily gripped crown to function properly. But then if one looks underneath the domed sapphire crystal on this watch, you see the dial, which comes in two variants. Now before I speak about the two variants, the general format of the dial is very much of that mid-century military design. So one sees the triangular tooth-style hour markers running around the edge, which are luminescent, in addition to the numerals running around there with the 12-hour graduations and the 24-hour graduations in order to match that military need. Now the hands are also typically Hamilton styled and feature luminescent centres with a large counterweight on the second hand to allow you to see when the watch is running. What I love about this watch is that Hamilton haven't lost the typical style of the original watch in favour of adding lots of text to the dial. Instead, they've kept the text very simple down to simply having Hamilton and Swiss made at the bottom of the dial, which I think really is enough because the rest of the information is provided on the case back anyway, and so the dial remains uncluttered and completely symmetrical, which is a real pleasure to see, whether you want to use this watch as a field watch or simply as an attractive piece of design. Where the dials are concerned, there are two versions available. The more classically correct of the two is the black variant, which comes on a green strap with leather inserts. However, if you want something which is a bit more flamboyant or a bit more different, then you can go for the version with an aged dial. And this dial appears like the tropical dials one sees on vintage watches, where the dial has lost its black colour and has instead gained a sort of a warm brown colour instead. And this one is matched with a beige strap, and so gains the appearance of something used in the desert, for example, rather than the perhaps more temperate climate one would expect to see the black dial in. What does remain the same, however, irrespective of which version you choose, is the movement. And I think the movement in this watch was a very, very good choice, because they've gone for the ETA 2801-2, which is a movement which isn't one of the 80-hour power reserve movements used in a great deal of Hamiltons, but the benefit of not having the full 80-hour power reserve is that you get a higher beat rate, and so that means the second hand runs in a much more smooth tick, as opposed to the 6 ticks per second seen on the 80-hour versions. This runs at 8 ticks a second. It also does have a manually wound setup, so rather than having an automatic winding rotor, you have to wind the watch every 42 hours. And this really isn't a problem in my eyes, because it's still a nicely jewelled movement, which will last for many years to come, but simply requires a little bit more involvement from the owner, which I think is no bad thing. And of course it is a Swiss-made movement, but the beauty of this watch is it also loses its thickness down to 9.5mm, which is a real benefit if you want to wear this watch on more regular occasions, or on a nice thick NATO strap, and as a result of this thin case, it won't pose any problems in terms of catching on cuffs. And I think, of course, matched with that domed sapphire crystal, it makes a very, very slick watch, and one which for £375 is exceptionally good value from a big manufacturer. The next watch I'd like to speak about is a pilot's watch from Hanhart, and this does leap up somewhat in price, but I think reasonably so, because Hanhart played a really crucial role in the history of aviation watches, because their watches produced in Germany in the 1930s and 40s as pilots' chronographs were really used as a template for the Type 20 chronograph pilots' watches created by the French Air Force, which have now become really the benchmark of what you compare a pilot's watch against. And so it's rather interesting to see how this brand has progressed and has created some rather impressive watches in terms of history, but also they have a very particular aesthetic and look which is very, very charming. Now, the watch in question is the Hanhart Pioneer Preventer 9. And the Preventer 9 takes the form of one of their two three-hand models, because they do also produce the Pioneer 1, which is in many ways a more simple watch with a more angular and more old-fashioned case, but it has central seconds and the date, whereas I find this, the Preventer 9, perhaps a slightly more interesting piece on the basis that it's a model which is fundamentally unique in terms of its dial style, the way it presents itself with its case, and is perhaps a bit more versatile due to its curves. But the watch is 40mm from side to side and 12.15mm from the top of the crystal to the back of the case back. And the watch in many ways is beautifully finished in the details. The case has a wonderfully fine brushed finish, but with a number of polished elements along the bottom, for example, of that bezel and along the edge of the lugs to provide a very complex look and something which is not simply your average brushed watch. The watch also has one of Hanhart's two styles of bezels, because on a lot of their chronographs you'll see their ribbed bezels with a red piece at 12 o'clock, which allows you to use it for timing. This version uses a more simple style of bezel with a sort of a concave style of indent into it, which is then brushed and provides a very elegant surround for the crystal and serves the purpose of protecting the crystal from bumps and knocks, as really should be the purpose of a bezel. And in terms of the crystal you get on this watch, you get a sapphire crystal which is domed, but subtly so without giving any sort of box to it, and so as a result making it more versatile on the wrist, but also has an internal anti-reflective coating, which a lot of people tend to prefer to a double anti-reflective coating, because for a lot of watches the external coating tends to scratch much more easily than sapphire, and so makes the crystal look old beyond its years. Now, aside from the beautiful leather strap with the riveting, the first element of the case which suggests the aviation heritage of this watch is the crown, because it's oversized and of course beautifully signed with the Hanhart logo. But it's large in order to be used with gloves on, for instance, and I think mirrors the technicality, but the simplicity and the classical form of the dial. And the dial comes in two variants, but both share the same general style, because they have Hanhart 1882 and automatic, and these are the only markings on them, and of course these are German-made watches, and the style of the dial is very, very typical. Because with that style of rail track marking along the edge of the dial, it's very quick and easy to read, and of course one has the luminescent indices, which take the form of these Arabic numerals, which are both simple but very classical in their form and run around the edge of the dial. Then you also notice it has small seconds at 9 o'clock, and these run on a sunken sub-dial, which is nicely finished with, of course, a polished metal hand running in the centre. The central two hands are also beautifully finished, and are formed in this cathedral style, with large luminous plots on their centre, but divided by these particular divisions across them, which give a real charm to them, with that radish-style end to the hour hand. And so I think as far as the dial goes, it suggests the same technicality as the 100-metre water resistance would suggest, but whilst also giving a very classical style that will look excellent whether you're wearing the watch with a suit or with a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. And where the movement is concerned, you get quite an interesting piece, because you get the automatic movement HAN 4112, which is based on the Sleater SW200. And so this runs at the full 28,800 vibrations per hour, and of course has 30 joules because it's modified to take this small second counter at the 9 o'clock position. The movement also has been fitted with Hanhart's skeletonized rotor, which unfortunately can't be seen because the caseback is closed, but you do still get a wonderful propeller motif on the caseback, which is a nice touch and does show a real attention to detail and a real care to show a really lovely presentation. Whether you choose to take the watch on the leather strap, which is beautifully riveted and given a nice contrasting stitch pattern, or you go for the metal bracelet, which is a fine link bracelet, you'll be paying £1,085, which I think is an excellent price, bearing in mind the fact that this is a watch made by a small manufacturer that make the watch in a very personal sort of way, which is something which often isn't seen with larger brands, and so you get a really very personal touch with these watches, which is a wonderful thing to have, and something of a charm in terms of the price you're paying for it, and as being a very interesting and a unique watch on the market. Simply reading the specifications of this Longines Heritage 1945, it would be very easy to compare it to that Hanhart. However, in many ways this is a fundamentally different watch, because despite almost perfectly sharing the dimensions of that Hanhart and also having small seconds, it's a watch which plays its vintage style in a very different way. Whereas the Hanhart is a very formal sports watch, the Longines is a dress watch in every way. It's an oversized dress watch, admittedly, especially for the period, but nonetheless fits into the modern style of wearing larger watches extremely well, but with a very delicate touch, and with a styling touch which is very reminiscent of the 1940s, and of post-war dress watches with leaf-style hands and small seconds. The dimensions of this watch certainly live up to the idea of it being an oversized dress watch, because it's 40mm from side to side, and 12mm thick. So it's by no means a small watch, but I think lives up the concept that watches in that period, despite the fact that they were smaller at 37mm, were designed to be watches for every day and not simply formal occasions. And this is of course celebrated in the dial, but firstly the case, which is fully polished and gives a very simple form to the casual glance, but if one looks more carefully, it's actually a very complex and extremely well designed form. Around the dial one sees a really rather lovely flat bezel, which is polished as is the rest of the case, but adds a bit of a border and a rim around the dial and helps to proportion the watch. Likewise, the short lugs are extremely sharply pointed on their tip and curve wonderfully down towards the wrist, to both increase their presence from the side but also reduce their view from the top, which creates a very interesting interplay, and I think the use of a very high-level polishing on this watch really does help to emphasise this. Of course, the crown also matches the style, which is flattened, but still quite wide in terms of its diameter, which again is perfect for this timepiece. Now, if one continues through the case and looks past that wonderfully domed sapphire crystal, one comes to an area of this watch which was very highly celebrated and discussed when it was released last year. Because the dial on this watch is a wonderful copper, and has been brushed from top to bottom in this sort of vertical form, with very minimal text in terms of having simply Longines and automatic on the dial, with Swiss made below the 6 o'clock. Now, whilst this dial is actually more complex than the original, because the original had simply had a matted effect, whereas here the brushing brings out the metal, one still retains the same rather interesting arrangement of indices, where one has the external run of individual minutes, but around the smaller internal run, if you will, one has a mix of Arabic numerals in a very sedate, quite sober style, and these applied pearls of indices, which are polished metal and give a wonderful balance of a delicate nature against something more utilitarian. And of course one has a continuation of this interplay between colour and form with that subdial at 6 o'clock, which features the small seconds. And of course this is sunken and has a sort of concentric ring pattern on it, which I think gives a delicate touch to the dial, and helps to offset the bluing of the hands and those wonderful leaf styles held by the hours and the minutes. A detail which I think looks really wonderful is the fact that they've capped the centre of the hours and the minutes hands. And this means that they've capped it with a small polished piece as opposed to a blued piece, which gives a wonderful interplay between that centre of the dial and also those indices placed around the dial. And I think it's these little balances of detail and of symmetry that create a watch which is fundamentally very simple and makes something really wonderful out of this. Inside this watch one has a calibre called the L609, and what this is effectively a rebranded, reworked, and Longines-specific version of the ETA 2895-2. And so this is very much a movement which, despite being a very widespread movement in terms of its use, is an extremely reliable piece, but also is a movement which was originally conceived in the mid-20th century to be a very, very slim automatic movement, as a result of integrating the automatic winding into the centre of the movement and not simply placing it on the top, which was very clever then, and I think remains a very interesting movement in terms of what it offers and also its history. And so I really wouldn't mock this movement, despite being something of an industry standard. It's very much the sort of movement you'd want in this watch, which is reliable, extremely accurate, and also able to have those beautiful small seconds. And so at £1,330, I think this is an exceptionally good deal, because Longines quality is legendary in terms of the way these watches are made, and just the general standards to which Longines tend to produce their watches. The hands are very nicely curved on their top, the dial is extremely beautifully done, and the case has been done simply but tastefully, and in a way which really does scream quality, which is something I really appreciate from a brand like this. And so for the price this watch is, I think it makes an excellent option if you want something which is quite vintage in its styling, but fundamentally very versatile. In a video speaking about no-date watches, which were very, very well designed and sorted, and that, above all, offered extremely good value, it's unsurprising that I was always going to include a Tudor Black Bay. And the Tudor Black Bay I've selected is the same one as I selected a few weeks ago in my video about the most versatile watches on the market. Because this is the Tudor Black Bay 58, and so it's their 39mm reincarnation of a mid-century, effectively a mid-century Tudor Submariner. And whilst I admit this choice was perhaps obvious, I think it's nonetheless an incredibly good watch, and one which can't really be beaten in the sector of no-date watches in the low £2,000 mark sort of range. Because this is a watch with a 200-metre water resistance, and the design which is really universally classically accepted as what is really to be seen in a dive watch, with that beautiful rotating bezel and of course those wonderful polished flanks. At 39mm in diameter and 11.9mm thick, it's a very well proportioned dive watch in terms of remaining very, very wearable and quite slender in its build. Because one criticism that was regularly levelled at Black Bays was that they were simply too tall, with their very tall case flanks and their heavily domed sapphire crystals. But with this watch, Tudor have really been able to rein it in and make a watch which is both classically designed and classically correct, but also one which is able to take on a form which is far more wearable and more enjoyable for more people. Now, the general design of the watch is of course that of a traditional dive watch, with that oyster-style case, except like oyster cases of old, this one has wonderful bevels down its edges, and a very fine level of concentric brushing around the case, and not brushing that runs straight down the lugs, unlike a modern Submariner. Likewise, the bezel is slightly different, because it features the traditional marker at 12 o'clock with a little bit of red, as with 1960s Rolex Submariners, in addition to black and gold, which gives a fantastic look, which admittedly wasn't something they had in the period, but still looks fantastic. Naturally, the bezel also is quite a lot more slender than a modern watch, with a coin edge rather than a large knurling, which again is a nice touch which Tudor really considered to create something unified, and something which matches the crown perfectly. Sitting atop the watch is a rather beautifully domed sapphire crystal, which is box-domed so it moves upwards before doming subtly over the top of itself. And this allows the whole crystal to take on a more old-fashioned persona, but also to add a slightly more interesting element to the watch, which otherwise I think would have been lost. The dial has also been extremely well chosen because it's domed, as opposed to being flat, which is something you don't immediately notice, but after handling the watch for a few minutes starts to become apparent. And Tudor use a very subtle style of matting on the surface of the dial. So rather than being a sort of unified matted texture, they've used a particular type of graining that allows the dial to look both refined but also slightly more rough and more appealing. Then all the text on the dial is in gold, of course, to replicate the gilt dials of the mid-20th century, in addition to the gilt indices around the edge of the dial, which give a wonderful railway style as they're connected, and make the whole dial appear smaller, but nonetheless slightly more old-fashioned and very delicate. These details also perfectly match the indices themselves, which are these applied indices in the traditional Rolex Submariner triangles, circles and rectangles, which adorn the full circle of the dial. And of course, bearing in mind there's no date on this watch, you get perfect symmetry, and because this is inspired by older watches, the index at 12 o'clock, which is of course that triangle, is elongated, which I like a great deal more than a modern Submariner style. And of course these are all gilt to match those wonderful snowflake hands, which adorn the centre of the dial, and give both a bold, but also a very delicate and subtle style. Where the movement of this watch is concerned, Tudor have moved away from their MT5600 in-house movements, and instead, to fit this smaller case, have conceived the new MT5402. And the MT5402 is a movement which takes all of the technology from their other movements, but renders it smaller and redesigns it. So, for example, the balance bridge is integrated right into the movement to make it more compact. However, you still get a COSC-certified movement here, so it still will keep time to within chronometer certification, and nonetheless will still retain its 70-hour power reserve, meaning you can put the watch down on a Friday evening and pick it up on the Monday morning, and it'll still be running just fine. Then in terms of technology, it has a silicon balance spring which is more stable but also is more resistant to magnetism, and has their famous free-sprung variable inertia balance, which means that rather than regulating your balance through the length of the balance spring, instead you change the distance and the attachment of various weights around the edge of the balance to change the way it moves, which is a more stable but more difficult way to regulate it, and it's great to see this in these Tudors. And so with all these specifications, I think the price of £2,340 to £2,560 is actually very reasonable, because you are getting a heck of a lot of watch in terms of movement specifications, and the general build of the watch, which is made with a great deal of care and a really wonderful attention to detail. And of course, in terms of straps, you have the choice between leather straps, which give a very classical look to the watch, or indeed you have the woven straps, which are exclusively made for Tudor and are the most wonderful quality. Or you can go for the direction which I personally would choose with this watch, which is to go for the bracelet, which features rivets down the side and looks like an old folded bracelet, but of course nonetheless is a solid modern one, and so won't stretch over time. And of course one has the Tudor clasp, which is again solid as well. And so I think in terms of the version that'll keep its value best, I'd recommend you spend the full £2,560 and you get the bracelet, because it'll be more difficult to get hold of and potentially much more expensive to buy if you then change your mind. The final watch in this video is an interesting product of the German brand Nomos, which is based in Glashütte. And they're a brand which specialises in Bauhaus-inspired, very minimalistic dress watches. And they've certainly become extremely well known for these, with their Tangente and their Tangomat, for example. But they've also become more known for quite playful designs these days, with models like the Metro, for example, or the Minimatic, which give a really interesting play on the concept of a modern dress watch. However, with this piece, the Ahoi, they've created a piece which is a wonderful balance between a sports watch and a dress watch, but in a true sense that it's able to perform both extremely well. So its formal case, which resembles the lines of the early Nomoses with its cylindrical form and those wonderful styles of angular lugs, give it a timeless but also very crisp design, which could be aligned with any sort of dress watch on the market in this Bauhaus genre. Of course, whilst one could say the design of this watch is overly simplified, with that cylindrical form and those quite two-dimensional lugs, there are elements which suggest that this watch is perhaps more robust than one might think. Touches such as that crown guard, which protects the crown and raises it away from the case, whilst also surrounding it on its sides. And I think the design of this watch, whilst being very minimalistic where the case is concerned, is extremely elegant and allows the eye to be drawn towards the dial, which really is the centrepiece of all Nomos watches. Of course, rather interestingly, this watch is actually rated as a dive watch by Nomos. So Nomos themselves state that this watch is suitable for diving, with a 200-metre water resistance. Now, of course, in a watch which is 40.3mm in diameter and only 10.5mm thick, or 10.6 depending on which case back you choose, it's quite remarkable to see a dress watch like this capable of resisting that sort of pressure. But nonetheless, I love the concept of amalgamating what is a very classically correct dress watch with something as robust as a dive watch. Of course, in addition to the fact that the crown is now protected, you do also get this watch on a style of nylon strap, instead of getting it on a conventional leather strap, which I think is suitable for this watch's purpose. But then the dial, which is very traditional Nomos, is extremely well conceived. Now, I'm referring to two models in this particular video, because this comes either in the standard Ahoi or in the Ahoi Atlantic version. Now, the difference between the Atlantic and the standard model is that the Atlantic has this dark blue dial, and the Superluminova is a different colour, with the Luminova on the Atlantic version being dark grey, whilst it's white on the standard version, which has a galvanised silver-plated dial. However, both share the same general specifications, so one sees that on the white version, one can clearly see the fact that one has these wonderful Bauhaus indices, which are highly legible, but also incorporate these numerals with a very simple style of font, which works beautifully with the Nomos Glashütte branding and the Made in Germany. Likewise, they do have small seconds at 6 o'clock in orange on both models, which make them very, very legible, but still, thanks to a sunken dial with concentric rings, give them a very classical element. The other element which varies between the standard Ahoi and the Atlantic is the treatment of the hands. Because with the standard Ahoi you get rhodium-plated hands with blue luminova inlay, which give this light sort of baby blue colour to the middle of those hands, which I think is a very delicate but also very attractive touch. Whereas by contrast on the Atlantic, you get gold-plated hands, which are also echoed on the various other elements of the dial, whilst you also get green luminova instead, which I think offsets the gold slightly better and gives that sort of element of the sea in its classical form to the watch, which I think is absent from the standard version, though of course that has a more versatile appeal, and I think each version will have its own audience. Now, where using this watch is concerned, I certainly wouldn't use it as a real dive watch. And the reason why I say that is not because I don't trust Nomos' 200 metre water resistance, but rather because the features the watch offers aren't sufficient to class this watch as a scuba diving watch, or make it quite frankly safe to use. The reason why I say this is because the ISO rating for dive watches is generally quite a good way to examine a watch in terms of whether or not it'll be suitable. And so on this watch the hands aren't easily differentiated because they're not different shapes, and also the second hand isn't luminescent, so you can't tell if the watch is running or not in the dark underwater. And then of course there's the problem of the luminescence of the watch not having a clear 12 o'clock, where all the indices are identical, and then there's the fact there's no bezel on the watch, which is an added complication. But I think as a whole though, the design of the case and the dial is very cleverly done to create the best of both worlds. And the movement inside the watch is the in-house DUW 5001, which was one of the very early in-house movements from Nomos, but has been continually updated and kept really abreast of any new developments, because it retains a 43-hour power reserve with 26 joules, and is an in-house movement which is beautifully decorated with perlage and other finishing on the surface of the rotor, which is skeletonized, and all the bridges one can see. It also features the new Nomos swing system, which is their own proprietary escapement, which is normally an extremely expensive and difficult thing for a brand to do if they're not going to go to a large manufacturer, and often these movements are quite unstable, so it's a testament to Nomos that they're able to produce an escapement of their own. Now, one detail is that if you go for the watch at its base price, which is £2,760, you don't get an exhibition case back. And this option is only available on the silver-dialed version. The Atlantic automatically comes with the exhibition case back at a higher price. But if you do want that on the silver-dialed version, you have to pay a couple of £100 more. And so this means that one has a price bracket of between £2,760 and £3,160. Which I think is a very reasonable price for a watch, which I think is a fantastic balance of two worlds. And of course you can get the date version if you particularly fancy it, but for the purposes of this video, I'm sticking to the no date. And so I think this is a nice way to round off the video, because it's the ultimate all-rounder really, in terms of giving you everything you might want from an active timepiece. And so I'll conclude the video there, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of the video, and which of these watches was your favourite. And so if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.